What if your body was already burning its most dangerous fat, and the first sign wasn't in the mirror at all? Visceral fat is different from the fat you can pinch. Researchers now classify it as metabolically active tissue because it behaves more like an organ than a storage compartment. It wraps around your organs and contributes to insulin resistance, inflammation, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease from the inside out. But here's what most people miss. When visceral fat starts leaving, the first clues aren't physical. They're psychological, behavioral, biological, and they show up weeks before the scale moves. The clearest early sign? Food stops controlling your thoughts. Most people don't realize that's happening because they're waiting for the scale to tell them, not because their willpower improved, because their insulin signaling did. This is where the science gets interesting. Visceral fat doesn't just sit there. It actively disrupts insulin signaling. As it accumulates around the liver and pancreas, insulin sensitivity drops. Blood sugar becomes unstable, rising and crashing throughout the day. And when that happens, the brain responds the way it's designed to. It demands fuel, constantly. The result? Intrusive food thoughts, random cravings, wandering into the kitchen without meaning to. Most people blame themselves for this, but it isn't a character flaw. It's biology. And there's a second hormonal layer most people never hear about. Visceral fat also produces leptin, a hormone the brain uses to register fullness and satisfaction after eating. In a healthy system, leptin signals the hypothalamus to stop eating. But when visceral fat is chronically elevated, leptin levels stay elevated too. And over time, the brain stops responding to the signal. This is called leptin resistance. It means the brain never quite receives the message that the body has enough. So hunger persists, cravings continue. Even large meals don't fully satisfy. It isn't greed, it's receptor failure. Here's where it shifts. As visceral fat begins to shrink, both insulin and leptin sensitivity can start recovering together. Blood sugar stabilizes, the brain's fullness signal begins working again, and something quietly changes. The food noise disappears. Cravings become quieter. Meals feel like choices again instead of compulsions. Many people notice this before they lose a single pound on the scale. The body is already changing. The scale just hasn't caught up. The second sign is one most people blame on age. The afternoon crash starts disappearing. This is where most people get it wrong. They assume the 2 p.m. slump is normal, that it comes with getting older, or sleeping less, or just the pace of modern life. But visceral fat is doing something specific here. It continuously releases inflammatory molecules, including IL-6 and TNF-alpha, that circulate through the bloodstream and disrupt the mitochondria, responsible for producing cellular energy. This is called chronic, low-grade inflammation, and it doesn't feel like traditional inflammation. There's no swelling, no obvious pain. It just quietly taxes the entire system. Energy production slows. Mental clarity blurs. The body works harder to do less. But there's another layer that makes this worse, and it involves cortisol. Visceral fat contains a significantly higher concentration of cortisol receptors than subcutaneous fat. This makes it uniquely sensitive to stress hormones. When cortisol rises from poor sleep, chronic stress, or unstable blood sugar, visceral fat responds by storing more aggressively. And as visceral fat grows, it produces more inflammatory output, which further stresses the body and keeps cortisol elevated. It becomes a self-reinforcing loop. Stress drives visceral fat. Visceral fat drives more stress hormones. And in the middle of that loop, the body never fully recovers between days. This is why people with elevated visceral fat often report feeling tired even after a full night of sleep. The recovery process is being disrupted at a cellular level before they even wake up. But as visceral fat decreases, inflammatory output drops and cortisol signaling begins to normalize. The mitochondria recover. Sleep quality often improves, not because bedtime habits changed, but because the biological conditions that were interfering with deep sleep are no longer as present. And people start noticing something unexpected. They wake up feeling more rested. Afternoons feel clearer. That familiar midday crash, the one they assumed was just their life now, starts fading. Not overnight, but steadily. And that shift in energy is often one of the earliest signals that something real is happening inside. The third sign is the one almost everyone overlooks. The waist changes before the weight does. Most people step on the scale first, and when the number doesn't move, they assume nothing is working. But visceral fat doesn't behave like surface fat. It sits deep inside the abdominal cavity, not underneath the skin, but wrapped around the organs themselves. What makes this anatomically unique is where visceral fat drains. Unlike subcutaneous fat, which releases fatty acids into general circulation, visceral fat drains directly into the portal vein, the blood vessel that feeds directly into the liver. This is why visceral fat has such an outsized effect on metabolic health. Its byproducts, free fatty acids, inflammatory molecules, and hormonal signals, go directly to the liver before reaching the rest of the body. Over time, this contributes to fatty liver accumulation and worsening insulin resistance at the organ level. But it also means that when visceral fat starts shrinking, the liver is often one of the first organs to benefit. Liver fat decreases, metabolic processing improves, and the inflammatory load carried by the portal system begins to ease. As it shrinks, visceral fat creates physical space internally. The belly softens, a belt notch shifts, a shirt fits differently around the middle. Meanwhile, the scale can stay flat or even tick upward, because muscle, water retention, and digestive contents all add weight too. Research consistently shows that reductions in waist circumference closely track reductions in visceral fat even when total body weight remains unchanged, which means the measuring tape may reveal progress weeks before the bathroom scale does. This isn't a consolation prize, it's the more accurate signal. Here's what matters most. These three signs rarely happen in isolation. They tend to arrive together. Cravings become quieter, energy becomes steadier, the waist begins shifting, and suddenly, a person realizes something important. Their body is no longer fighting them. There's a reason these changes tend to emerge earlier than expected, and it comes down to how the body prioritizes fat burning. Visceral fat is more metabolically active than subcutaneous fat. It turns over faster. It responds more quickly to changes in diet, movement, and hormonal conditions. Researchers have found that in many cases, the body preferentially reduces visceral fat stores before making significant reductions in surface fat. This is counterintuitive to most people. They expect to see the fat they can touch leave first, but the fat they can't see is often already responding, weeks or months before the visible layer begins to change. This is why the early signs described here matter. They're not coincidences. They're evidence of a shift that's already underway inside the body. This is what visceral fat loss actually looks like from the inside. Not dramatic before and after photos. Not a sudden number drop on the scale. It's insulin sensitivity recovering, leptin signaling restoring, cortisol normalizing, inflammation retreating, the liver beginning to process metabolic load more efficiently, the metabolic environment slowly returning to the state it was designed to function in. And these changes carry long-term significance. Reducing visceral fat is directly associated with lower risk of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and metabolic syndrome, not because the weight changed, but because the fat that was disrupting the system is no longer there. So if you've noticed fewer cravings, steadier energy, or small changes in how your clothes fit, even though the scale hasn't moved, don't dismiss those signals. They're not coincidences. They may be the first evidence that visceral fat is finally starting to leave. And the most important changes your body makes often happen long before anyone else can see them. Because when visceral fat starts disappearing, the first thing that changes isn't how you look. It's how your body works.